Mm.
And I think that it will have an impact. And it'll be interesting to see how the media spun it.
Yeah.
But you know, it's a pretty good springboard for him to actually introduce better taxation.
But yeah. Yeah.
You don't know.
Yeah.
Because it's all
Yeah.
perception these days, and
Well, you just got to wait a while for people to get the perception it's
yeah.
unfair, eh? And then
And I'm living in the bad part of the world now because I mean, I like it where I live, but I'm in Waitangi and it's all full of people
all for
from
the
all
bloody
the other
Tories,
countries.
yeah. That must be horrible, yeah.
Well, it's lovely to
Yeah.
live.
You're in Canberra, you don't find many Tories.
No, I wouldn't. Oh,
Yeah.
in Canberra? No.
No,
No.
not many, no.
Yeah. Yeah, I never really thought about what Canberra, but it'll be like Wellington, won't it? Just
Yeah, well there's,
more informed.
yeah, there's 3 seats in the House of Representatives and they're all Labor. 2 seats in the Senate, one Labor, one Independent.
I always thought the politics over there was so
Oh, it is, it is. Yeah. And the corruption that you just don't see. I mean, I chose not to join the ALP because of the levels of corruption. Yeah. When the factionalism is, yeah. 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 Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And often the differences between the factions are not necessarily philosophical. People join the faction that they think is going to serve their interests best, and sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But I mean, there's a guy, Andrew Lee, economics professor who's been in Parliament a long bloody time, and he should be the first person to put into cabinet, but because he's not in a faction, he hasn't got a show. I mean, he doesn't even get considered because the factions have their allocation of people in the cabinet, and mm, yeah, he's in jail now. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm, mm. Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Mm. Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. Mm. Yeah, well, I had a premier there for a while, Nathan Rees, who tried to take them on, and he got the party constitution altered so that as premier he could kick a few people out of cabinet, which he did, but within days McDonald and his mates had rolled him. Yeah, 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 yeah,
I didn't
yeah.
notice that with your river, but is there any other association or connection?
I've been a Trinity trainer for many years, and B, I've been working on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals through career. But that was a while ago. That was 8 years ago.
Okay, yep. All right.
You'll be 5.
Sit here. Yep, yep. Is it working? Oh. Is this thing working? Yeah, g'day. Hi. Hello? Hello? Okay.
You sit in there.
All right, okay. Yep. So is this the right volume?
Is that good for the audience?
Yeah, okay. Yep.
Yes, okay. Is that all right, speak about that level? Okay. Right, welcome everybody to the New Zealand Fabian Society event tonight. Mike Smith's my name. Tonight we're going to hear from Professor Dominic O'Sullivan on indigeneity, culture and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and also Peter Glensaw, who's worked in treaty training and on the SDG goals, will comment on Dominic's presentation. So the Dominic suggests that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples could be revised to support self-determination as a more far-reaching and ambitious project than they imagine in their current form. So welcome, Dominic, back to Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we remember you from many years ago. And so we're looking forward to very much to hearing your presentation tonight. So thank you. Over to you.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Ko te mea tō tahi a mihana ki te rongarawa I o matua kore. He honore he karore ki tana ingoa. He maunga rongo ki te whenua. He whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Ko Māmari te waka. Ko te rarawa te iwi. Ko te uri o hina te hapu. Ko Dominic O'Sullivan. Kia ora everybody and good evening and thanks for coming along on this rather cold evening, but nothing like Canberra cold, which I'm going back to on Sunday. Nice to see you, Mike, again after all these years, and Pat, whom I've not seen for a very long time, but we keep in touch on Facebook, as one does these days. And Indigeneity, Culture and the UN Sustainable Development Goals is the title of my most recent book, which was published only 10 days ago by Palgrave Macmillan. And I was introduced to the Sustainable Development Goals by a colleague at Charles Sturt University who thought they held great promise for creating a fairer and more just society. And I began to have a look at perhaps what they offer, especially from an Indigenous perspective, or Indigenous, and perhaps just as importantly, what they don't. As I'm going to discuss, there are some profound limits to the goals, but there are also some ways of thinking and some ways of conceptualising policy problems that they present. So I think one can't look into the goals too much for specific policy prescriptions, but one can identify some frameworks for thinking about how policies might work more effectively for more people. And so just by way of introduction, in 2015, 193 UN member states, including New Zealand, adopted an agenda for sustainable development. That agenda comprised 17 sustainable development goals, 169 targets, and 232 indicators. So already one can see the scale and scope of ambition here. And just from those numbers alone, I guess one gets a sense of how complicated this task is that the UN has set itself and set its member states. And but what they're also remarkable for is their inattention to culture and quite how you address things like poverty, education, health, economic growth, employment, all those things without thinking about culture is, I think, rather mysterious and mystifying. Nobody can look at the world, think about their place in the world, think about their relationships with others through any lens but a cultural one. And the failure to recognise that, I think, does create some problems. And culture too is an indispensable constituent of justice and essential to Indigenous self-determination. And I'll connect that theme a little bit later this evening to contemporary debates about Te Tiriti or Waitangi and how it works and how it doesn't work and how people think it might work better. Because I think, you know, that is one of the points we can take from the weaknesses of the goals that I think ought to be at the forefront of any consideration that we give to policy, whether that's as policy makers, as citizens commenting and having an interest in what's going on around us. I think we need to keep that at the forefront of our thinking. The 17 goals, I won't list them all, but these are the ones that I focus on most significantly in the book. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, decent work and economic growth, life on land, and peace, justice and strong institutions. And while I think that they're all important and they set aspirations that are broadly agreeable to people across the political spectrum and across cultures and jurisdictions, I think the one that's most interesting in terms of the Indigenous right to self-determination is that last one, peace, justice and strong institutions. And sorry, I knew this was going to happen. I'll just pause for a moment, see if I can fix this up. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, keep going, thank you. Yeah, peace, justice and strong institutions. And that invites, I think, some very important questions. What makes a public institution just? What does a just school look like? What does a just hospital look like? What does a just parliament look like? And it's from the goals that we can draw these kinds of questions that I think can usefully inform our thinking. What you know, when kids go to school, for example, when Māori kids go to school, what makes it a good place to be, an effective place, a worthwhile place? Some years ago, before I left New Zealand, I did some work with Russell Bishop and Mary Berryman on exactly this question. And we asked 15 and 16-year-olds, Māori kids, what is a good classroom for you? What does the teacher do in that classroom that makes it work? What makes it effective? And by working through those sorts of answers and responses, an effective teaching profile was developed, and that was used for teacher training across the country and still has significant influence in terms of how classrooms actually work. But if we're not interested in schools being just in the first instance, then we don't get to that kind of question. And like I said, it can be asked of any kind of public institution. And it's important in terms of the goal's overarching purpose, which is to ensure that development is sustainable and leaves nobody behind. And I think that leaving nobody behind is a potentially transformative, hugely transformative aspiration, because it is colonialism's antithesis. colonialism's whole point is to leave some people behind so that others may advance. So it doesn't even pretend to serve any objective good. It is there solely to subjugate the rights of some people, to allow the self-interest of others to prosper. And because that's such a big and significant and far-reaching goal, it can't be achieved within the goal's 15-year time frame. When the goals were adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2015, the Assembly said this is a 15-year project. In 15 years' time we're going to have finished with all this and we'll think of something else to do. I don't think that's possible with respect to Indigenous self-determination, because self-determination and colonialism, its antithesis, are enduring political relationships, political status. To be a self-determining people isn't something that you do today and forget about tomorrow. It's forever. So we've got this 15-year time frame to address as a major obstacle. And I think the way we can do that is by aligning the goals with instruments like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is concerned with self-determination as a universal right, a right that belongs to all of us, whoever we are, wherever we live, whatever our political or social circumstances. It's a right that belongs to all of us, but it belongs to Indigenous peoples just as much as to anybody else. So if we can think about the goals in those terms, draw the two together, allow the goals to be sorted by... Sorry, it's not my phone, is it? No, it's not. Okay, that's great. All right, so... and in our own context here in New Zealand, if we can think about whether the goals help us to conceptualise what Te Tiriti or Waitangi means, how it informs the way society works, the way government works, the scope that government must leave for rangatiratanga and those kinds of things, then we start to address that 15-year obstacle, I suggest. Sorry, I've gone back when I meant to go forward. So culture, I suggest, back to that overarching point, is foundational to contributing fairly to the public life of the state. Yet culture doesn't obviously influence the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. The two references that their 232 indicators make to Indigenous peoples are both narrow and homogenising. Indicator 4.1 refers to Indigenous people as the subject of concern for educating the vulnerable. So, the tone and the presentation is, as you're vulnerable, the state needs to fix your vulnerability. It's not about people's agency or self-determination or people's right and obligation to think about education for themselves and think about the kinds of institutions that might help with that. It also assumes that Indigenous peoples are not part of the state, so not part of those public institutions that are responsible for deciding how education systems work, whether that is at the various highest level of executive government. The assumption is that an Indigenous person just wouldn't be the Minister of Education, so they're not there to maybe address whatever vulnerabilities they might experience or to frame things differently in terms of agency. It assumes, from that level right down to the school classroom where policy is implemented by the teacher on the at that sort of point where people experience government policy in real life. So there's no sense of agency requiring, in our circumstances, for example, that Māori people are participant at all those levels. And indicator 2.3 is concerned for Indigenous people as small-scale farmers. I've not seen any evidence that Māori people in 2023 are content with small-scale farming. Agency and ambition are much bigger and more important than that, and because culture isn't part of the goals, there's no real framework for thinking about what that kind of ambition might mean in practice. But as I said, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples affirms that self-determination belongs not just to the Indigenous vulnerable, but to the wealthy, the healthy and educated. And it assumes that if one is wealthy and healthy and educated, one's been able to participate that as a cultural being, as a Māori person, not as an assimilated person or anything else. So this is where I think the declaration is very helpful. But on the other hand, in spite of that brief critique that I've offered, if we look to SDG 16, which, as I've said, is the goal that I think is the most important in terms of Indigenous self-determination because of its overarching purview and so on, we do find some value, and I think it was really this that made me think that this book is a project worth pursuing. The goals are not something that one can, dismiss in a few pages and move on to something else. There is some worthwhile study and thinking and exploration of ideas to be done. And so SDG 16, as I said, peace, justice and strong institutions, includes 5 targets which I think are especially relevant to Indigenous self-determination. The first of these is to promote the rule of law at the national and international levels and ensure equal access to justice for all. So in response to that, one might consider what's the rule of law that's implicit in Te Tiriti or Waitangi in the ways that it distributes political authority, the ability to make decisions. We've got the right of, the right of the state to govern, kawanatanga. What do Articles 2 and 3 of Te Tiriti say about how the rule of law might adopt and that might apply in that context? Rangatiratanga, how does that limit the scope of kawanatanga's authority and responsibilities? What does rangatiratanga mean in practice for iwi and hapu and other Māori political communities? And how does that shape what we mean when we talk about access to justice and when we talk about the rule of law? Similarly, citizenship. What are the rights and obligations of citizenship? And above, beyond those, and perhaps more importantly, what are the political capacities of citizenship? What are citizens allowed to do as expressions of their agency? Because if we are people who hold agency, we're by definition not vulnerable. And if we've got some kind of framework worked out or established that Te Tiriti offers, but we haven't quite perhaps established exactly what it means yet, but we've certainly got a conceptual framework for thinking about what the rule of law means in our context and what contextualises access to justice for everybody, not just as a vague concept that everybody says that's a good idea. What does it mean in practice? What does it mean for a rangatira to have access to justice as a rangatira? What does it mean for a Māori citizen to have access to justice, not as somebody assimilated into an imported system of government, but somebody who's an equal participant in shaping the society in which they live, and shaping the rules of political conduct, shaping the values of political conduct, and so on. And then SDG 16 also considers the development of effective, accountable and transparent institutions at all levels. So, we have that general Westminster presumption that the executive is accountable to Parliament, and through Parliament to the people, and through fair and democratic elections and so on, the Parliament is accountable to the people. And that's all good at one level. But does it work for Māori? In many ways, yes. In many ways, no. But I think if we're talking about accountable and transparent institutions, beginning with the Parliament especially, then how do the guaranteed seats in Parliament help? What lessons do they hold for Australia, for example, as it contemplates altering its constitution to guarantee an Indigenous voice to Parliament? Not a voice in Parliament, as we have here, not seats in Parliament, but a separate, distinctive voice to Parliament. How's that going to help achieve accountability? What kinds of powers and responsibilities does it need to be able to do that? Firstly, it needs, I guess, or Indigenous Australia requires the respect of the Australian people, and it's certainly not clear that respect is available, but we'll see when the referendum occurs. But I think SDG 16 gives us a philosophical rationale, a theoretical justification for considering these questions. Ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory and representative decision making at all levels. And that's a point that the ministerial review into the future for local government is considering here in New Zealand at present. And I was asked to prepare a public discussion paper to help the panel in its thinking. And the point I made with respect to this participatory and representative decision making is that the first question to ask, with reference to Tiriti especially, is not partnership and that kind of thing, which is very fashionable and has a lot of adherence, but what do councils actually need to do vis-a-vis what do Māori political communities need to do? What kinds of functions of councils actually better belong to iwi or hapu or marae? And asking that question about where does rangatiratanga fit in, how does it relate to kawanatanga, and then once those functions of local government that are clearly the domain of councils are worked out, how do Māori as Māori citizens participate, and so on. So there are questions of the distribution of power and authority that I think need to be considered here, and SDG 16 helps us rationalise that. And then there's this ensure public access to information and so on, which is really all part of accountability and transparency and responsiveness, perhaps a more specific way of saying some of these things. And promote and enforce non-discriminatory laws and policies for sustainable development. And in a moment I'll come to a framework for thinking about who decides what's non-discriminatory and how do we decide. If we're all agreeing that it's not a good thing for public policy to discriminate against Māori people in the ways that it often has and in some ways continues to do, who decides when it's not discriminatory anymore? And I'll come to that in a moment. But before doing that, I'd like to demonstrate my overarching argument that the goal's potential to make a difference, to not leave Indigenous people behind or include Indigenous peoples among those who are not left behind. I think we need to expand our thinking a bit and expand our knowledge base and our reference points. And one particularly promising way of doing that perhaps is to see what connections we can make or how we can deepen our consideration of SDG 16 with reference to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, particularly Articles 5 and 18. Article 5, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social and cultural institutions while retaining their right to participate fully, if they so choose, in the political, economic, social and cultural life of the state. So what we've got in the first part of that article is effectively rangatiratanga. What we've got in the second part is citizenship. So quite a different framing, I suggest, in partnership. Partnership can deal with the first part, but it can't deal with the second part, because partnership presumes or positions Māori beyond kawanatanga. I'm suggesting this article provides a way of bringing the two together, as indeed does Article 3 of Te Tiriti, citizenship, which is quite a different thing to the subjecthood that we thought about in 1840. And it's a thing that continues to evolve. It's not static, it's not a rule book that we have to try to conform to in the way that we organise ourselves. It's a concept that continues to evolve as our values evolve, as our sense of political possibility, our understanding of personal agency and collective agency. So all those things develop, citizenship develops, and that article brings the two together in a logical kind of way. And then we've got Article 18. Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own Indigenous making institutions. Now we've got that to a degree with the Māori seats in Parliament. We've got it in a different way with the Ngai Tahu authority to appoint members to Environment Canterbury, the Canterbury Regional Council, which is, I mean, there are quite compelling arguments against the arrangement there in terms of it not being a free and open election. It's an appointment processed by the Ngai Tahu Runanga, but that's what Ngai Tahu wanted, and that's their own procedure and process, I suppose. So it's an argument that still has to be given some weight. So these two articles, and indeed the Declaration more broadly, I think allow us to add a bit more substance and depth to the idea of a just institution. They make assumptions about the distribution of authority that might be conceptualised as just. However, as with everything, there are some limits. While Article 18 assures Indigenous peoples of the right to object to public policy measures that might be to their disadvantage, it does not entail a positive right to develop public policy. It presumes that Indigenous people are subjects of the state, not agents of their own aspirations. That's countered to a degree by Article 18 that says people need to have opportunities to participate and so on. But I think we need to consider ways of doing that, and whether the ways we do that in New Zealand at present are okay, or whether they might be strengthened. Because SDG 16 may also support the alternative idea that if public institutions are just, they will be just by the people's consent. And that's the foundational argument in liberal democratic theory. Democracy means that public institutions derive their power from the people's consent. But which people? All people or just some people? And that's a point that I don't think many societies in the world have settled terribly well. And it's an important consideration in contemplating and considering how democracy might work better. As they were developed by states, the goals are open to interpretation as top-down and distant. In contrast, the Declaration was drafted by Indigenous peoples and is a comprehensive and authoritative expression of their political aspirations. And there were quite significant Māori contributions to that declaration, and the government here indicated some interest in working out how it might give effect to the declaration, and then things are perhaps derailed by other political considerations, as happens from time to time. But nevertheless, together, the declaration and the goals may offer inclusion, independence and agency to peoples traditionally left behind by the colonial experiences of assimilation, discriminatory laws and policies. But as I've alluded to at the beginning, leaving nobody behind draws out the tension between colonialism and self-determination. It positions the fundamental objection to colonialism quite starkly. It wasn't a single event that happened a long time ago. It's an ongoing political relationship that can only be put to an end by the conscious choice of people to leave nobody behind. And I'm not sure that in New Zealand or anywhere else societies have thought of it quite in those terms and made conscious decisions that we're not leaving anybody behind. We're not a colonial state anymore. And the tension arises between colonialism and self-determination because there is no objective good that colonialism tries to serve. Its purpose is to assert some people's self-interest over another people's self-determination. The goals may then provide Indigenous peoples and the modern colonial state with a conceptual framework for responding to this tension. But I don't think the goals can do it by themselves. Another way of bringing this back to our own context here in New Zealand is through critical Tiriti analysis, a policy framework that I developed with colleagues Heather Kame and Tim McCreenor for thinking about a particular public policy's consistency with Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And a framework for promoting the idea that of integrating Te Tiriti rights of citizenship and rangatiratanga into policy making as a contributor to greater efficacy. And as a contributor to public institutions being able to be described as just institutions. And critical Tiriti analysis, which I'll describe in a moment, allows, I think, policy to work more effectively because the policy will have been developed by Māori people with reference to Māori epistemologies and with reference to Māori determined expectations of what policy should achieve. So framing policy development in terms of people's agency, people's ability to participate with authority in the policy process, as opposed to being the subject of somebody else's desire to address their vulnerability. And it shows how significant an omission it was for the goals to frame Indigenous peoples as peoples of limited needs and aspirations, and without the right of substantive influence over policy development. There ought to be no limit to human agency, because to human aspirations, because to put limits on people's aspirations is to put limits on people's ability to think, and people's ability to desire a better life, a better world, and so on. I think my slides have somehow gone out of order. Anyway, doesn't matter. So critical Tiriti analysis was developed in 2020, and it's interested in the state working differently. And the reason that 15-year time frame is deficient is because self-determination requires states to work differently. Not for 15 years, but forever. And we've applied critical Tiriti analysis mostly to health policy, but others have applied it elsewhere. The Ministry for the Environment, Ministry of Justice, and so on are using it to inform their work. And it shows how significant an omission it was for the goals to frame Indigenous peoples as peoples of limited needs, I said. Okay, so it asks questions like, have Māori people defined the policy's purpose? Does the policy work in ways that Māori people prefer? And these are all rationalised by the articles of the treaty. What we did was we went to the articles themselves and the preamble, which basically says that the point of this agreement is to provide for good government, to ensure that people can live together peacefully and in an orderly way, and so on. So that, I think, is as important as the articles themselves. The articles are, I guess, the pathway to good government, but good government is the overall purpose. So rather than thinking about partnership or the other principles that courts have elaborated and parliaments have tried to clarify, we went to the articles themselves and said, well, what do these mean? What do these mean? How can they guide policy making? And they can guide by policy making by asking questions such as these. Has a policy been made with reference to Māori values and epistemologies as Māori define them? Does it have a strong Māori evidence base? In health, for example, there's a huge Māori scholarship in terms of broad principles of what it means to be healthy and well and so on, the relevance of waitangi to health and well-being. There's a huge scholarship informed by clinical experience across a range of health disciplines. It's surprising how little of this is cited in the reference lists of official Ministry of Health policy documents. So it's not as though the material, the ideas are not there, haven't been developed. People are making conscious choices not to refer to them. And CTA is a framework that stops that happening. It says you can't make policies that are supposed to benefit Māori people without considering Māori ideas, Māori values and aspirations. Because if you don't do those things, you can't claim to be a just institution. Does the policy's development reflect rangatiratanga and active and distinctive Māori citizenship? So has there been active participation? Does it treat Māori as rangatira and citizens with the right to help make the decision? Or does it simply treat people as stakeholders to be consulted? All over the world, governments like to consult stakeholders. In New South Wales, there's a Minister for Customer Services, as those citizens are customers of government. And if you're a customer, if you're a stakeholder, you're not a participant. You might be entitled to a view, but you're not entitled to help make the decision. And Aristotle said the citizen is simply one who deliberates. And Aristotle, of course, excluded almost everybody from citizenship. But citizenship has evolved, and it still retains that basic capacity of deliberation. And as deliberators, we participate. We're not recipients of other people's ideas about what's good for us. We are allowed to have our own views and are allowed to have those views incorporated into the decision-making process. Does the policy disadvantage Māori in ways that do not disadvantage other citizens? From answers to these questions, one then asks how the policy might be improved. And what we've called this process is a process of indigenising policy making, which recognises that policy is not an abstract phenomenon pursuing a neutral and always agreeable conception of the common good. And that's one of the weaknesses with the goals themselves. SDG, for example, is concerned with quality education. Now, everybody can agree quality education is a good thing, but what that means in practice and how we get there is contextualised by all sorts of things, including culture. And for a school to be a just institution, or the Ministry of Education to be a just institution, it is, I think, assisted by asking these kinds of questions of themselves as they make policy and as they implement it. Sorry, I'm getting confused here with this thing. So the SDGs are concerned with improving people's quality of life. So is the Declaration, so is the Tiriti, and I think we've shown one way of bringing those instruments together through critical Tiriti analysis. And we've just published a journal article about 10 days ago in the journal Ethnicities, which, unlike most academic articles, is available free of charge. And we set out a process for asking questions such as the ones I've referred to, either as a policy maker involved in doing these things, or as a citizen or group of citizens interested in critiquing public policy. So it is, interested in making policy submissions or raising policy ideas through the different processes that are available. But if the overall objective is improving people's quality of life, we need to understand how people may contest colonialism's pervasiveness and construct lives built on self-determination. We need to know what we're asking in terms of how we measure quality of life. Indicators could be established to describe what self-determination looks like and measure the extent to which its rights and capacities are present in people's lives. However, measuring who, if anybody, is left behind is a matter of political values before it is a matter of statistical method. And in examples of how quality of life may be measured from Indigenous perspectives around the world, and which show the scope of Indigenous ambition, include things like the National Inuit Climate Change Strategy, the Teb Foundation Indigenous Peoples framework, the Māori Data Sovereignty Network Te Manauranga, the National Inuit Health Survey, and the Indigenous Navigator Project. So there are examples from jurisdictions all around the world on how this kind of thing can be done in practice. And what they also show is the diversity of Indigenous thought on what it means for a people to say that it is not left behind. They reinforce the idea that what is measured reflects broader conceptions of justice and citizenship. There are ways of asking, is this institution just? Is this policy just? And it's important to do those. But how to do it in terms of the goals as a broad overarching framework to perhaps make them useful and to draw out their potential to contribute to self-determination in ways that are most certainly possible but not quite there yet, I suggest, by way of example, instead of educating the vulnerable, SDG 4 could include an education indicators that say something like these things. Indigenous people may define quality education and pursue it through their own institutions and or those of the state. Indigenous people are at least proportionately present in the education workforce, have equitable influence on policy design and implementation, and have access to culturally cognizant and effective education. Instead of small-scale farming, SDG 15, Life on Land, could adopt new indicators such as Indigenous nations and people contribute with participatory parity to policy decisions in relation to life on land. So that means, in practical terms, when agriculture is being developed, Māori farmers, Māori people, citizens with an interest in agricultural policy, can enter that decision-making process with the same expectation of influence as anybody else. Being Māori isn't a constraint on participation. So a just institution will have arrangements in place that ensure that everybody can come along and participate with that same confidence, knowing that if their arguments are not the arguments that prevail, that are accepted, it's not because of some inherent discriminatory aspect of the decision-making process. And, you know, it's interesting to think of liberal democracy, liberal political theory more broadly, as an idea that says everybody can come to the party, but everybody's got to drink Lion Red. If you're not a Lion Red drinker, well, you still come in, but you stand on the edges and you watch everybody else having fun. A liberal democracy that says, well, whatever your preferred drink, you can still participate, and your views count as much as anybody else's. And water's maybe not as good as Lion Red, but it'll do the trick. It'll allow participation to carry on. And I also suggest, in the book I've suggested 2 or 3 additional indicators for each of the 17 goals that I think would immediately raise their contribution to self-determination anywhere in the world. And I'm not going to go through them all here, but just education and agriculture I think are particularly relevant because those are the points that the goals single out as important for Indigenous people, but then show how Indigenous people are actually missing from opportunities for agency and so on. So that Indigenous nations and people have equitable access to their territories for cultural and sustainable economic purposes, including employment and commercial development. Yeah, that's sort of the last of the slides, and I'm sorry I got myself a bit tangled up with this thing, but I think we got there in the end. But again, thanks for coming along. Kia ora hui tātou katoa. If anyone has any questions or points for discussion, we may have a bit of time, have we?
We do. Peter, would you like to just make some comments and respond to Dominic, and then we'll take some questions, okay?
Kia ora, ka nuinga mihi kia koutou katoa, kia koe e te rangatira, tēnā koe mō o whakaaro rangatira. Couple of comments, firstly about the SDGs and then about te Tiriti o Waitangi. For us in New Zealand, I was involved from 2013 to 2016 in setting up a national organisation linking the whole community sector together called Huie, Community Aotearoa. And one of the kaupapa that we decided to pick up in 2015 was the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, because what we saw happening was the United Nations had been through this quite astonishingly complex process of consultation with many thousands of people around the world to draw up the Sustainable Development Goals that all countries needed to aspire to, and they took over from the previous goals called the Millennium Development Goals, which were focused very much on poor countries. And so the focus, and they were extremely valuable, the Millennium Development Goals, but this is a much more dramatic and ambitious project to challenge all countries to address sustainable development. New Zealand signed up to those goals, as it did to the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples under a national-led government. But they immediately dumped the SDGs on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and said, well, this is all to do with the UN and international stuff, so you can have a look at it. And our job in Huie was to pick a few of the goals and to say, no, these are not about what Fiji should be doing or Papua New Guinea should be doing. These are about what Aotearoa should be doing. And so let's pick some of these goals. And we decided just to pick, I think, about 4 of them. A couple where we were doing really well, but we thought we could do better. One of them, for example, was to do with pay equity, where New Zealand is one of the top countries in the world in terms of getting pay equity. But we haven't actually got there yet. So we said, why don't we pick that one and really start to say, how can we make that final step to full pay equity? But also pick a couple where we're doing really poorly. And so one example of that was the carbon emissions targets, where New Zealand is pretty pathetic and subsequently has been getting worse in terms of emissions. So we said, let's mix and match a wee bit. So we don't just pick ones that we're terrible at and we'll all feel bad, or that we only pick ones that we feel good about and we'll all feel great. So that was our contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. They're almost invisible in Aotearoa, Dominic. I don't know if they are in Australia. The Green Party referenced the Sustainable Development Goals in its 2017 election manifesto. No one else did, as far as I know, and no one has taken almost any notice whatsoever of them in the years since then. So they are an exciting possibility for us to challenge ourselves as a nation to do better in this enormous range, as Dominic has said. Turning then to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and thank you so much for the... I'm afraid I'm kind of out of the some of my reading, and so I'm going to have to swat up on your critical
Tiriti analysis, which sounds pretty interesting, and I'll try and find out some more about that. But what excites me here in Aotearoa is the way that Te Tiriti o Waitangi is actually, in my view, beginning to be a happening thing in quite interesting ways. Over 12 years ago, here in Wellington, I was a regional councillor, and we set up a committee to prepare a plan for the natural resources of the region, the soil and the air and the water. And we opted, and this is in about 2010, 2011, something like that, we opted to create a committee of 14 people, 7 of the elected councillors and 7 appointees of the 7 iwi who are acknowledged as holding mana whenua here in different parts of the Wellington region. So that 14 people became the committee called Te Taiao, Te Upuku Taiao. And I was involved with that until I stood down from the council in 2013. It went ahead from day one saying we want to bring culture into this work. And so we want to be able to look at the resources of our community from the worldview of Te Ao Māori and from the worldview of the rest of us living in Aotearoa, which includes scientific and a lot of Western thinking. And we were able very successfully, I believe, to bring those together from day one in a process which today I suspect would be called co-governance. And it worked, and the world didn't fall apart, and nobody, as far as I know, was screaming and yelling about it. The plan has been produced, I don't know if it's come into effect yet because these things take ages in local government, but it has received unanimously warm support from all parts of the community. And I'm absolutely convinced that that is because it took seriously the various worldviews that make up our people here in Aotearoa. I'm part of a group that has been working now for 2 years or more called Te Reo o Ngā Tangata, the People Speak. And what we are trying to do is to explore some of the issues that Dominic has raised about how do you govern yourselves as a nation. We've become used to equating democracy with what is really representative democracy. So our system that we call the democratic system is every 3 years you elect some person and you send them off into an institution, a council or a parliament or whatever, and they, on your behalf, vote for things and decide on things. But that's not the only process, and I was really interested that Dominic quoted Aristotle, who said every citizen should deliberate, because we are working on what we call deliberative democracy. And deliberative democracy picks up in many countries they're called citizens' assemblies or citizens' juries, and in fact the whole jury system is the last vestige of deliberative democracy that we have in the Western world, whereby a randomly selected group of ordinary people get to decide something really important, in this case the guilt or innocence of a person charged with a crime. And but that pattern of getting ordinary people to hear about something, to talk about it, to study it, and then to come to a decision is becoming more and more picked up around the world through citizens' assemblies or citizens' juries. Australia is picking it up pretty enthusiastically. What we're trying to do is to say, how do we take this insight about an interesting form of democracy with Te Tiriti o Waitangi? And the way that we're doing it is we're working, in this case, with Ngāti Toa Rangatira and to hold an assembly process in Porirua about climate change. And it will take the form that has begun to emerge over the last 25 years, which some people call the two-house model. So we will hold a classical citizens' assembly, randomly selected people, including Māori people, will come together and consider the issue of climate change. At the same time, in the same complex, which will be on the marae at Takapuahi, on that marae complex, Ngāti Toa will be calling a meeting of Ngāti Toa people to talk about climate change. And we'll hear from the same experts at the same time, and they will do it their way, because under Tino Rangatiratanga, they're in charge of how it's going to all work. And the assembly will also be meeting. And then at the end of that process, the rangatira, the Ngāti Toa rangatira group will come up with two lists. One list will be, what is Ngāti Toa rangatira going to do about climate change? And that list is for themselves, because they're in charge of their own resources, their own people, their own destiny. So that is not a debatable list. They'll tell people about what it is they've decided, but they won't be asking, is that okay with you? The second list will be what they think everyone should be doing about climate change. And that list will be a group from each of the two assemblies will sit down and compare the lists of actions that they think should happen as Porirua responds to climate change. And hopefully agreement will be reached on a common list from that process. Now, I believe that that is beginning to give a 21st century outworking of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which honours the Tino Rangatiratanga that was promised in Te Tiriti, but it also honours the fact that all people together get a chance, including Māori, to be part of things. So really interesting to see how you're picking up the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm excited about, but I think your input is going to be helpful. So that's my comment.
Thank you.
Right, so anyone, time for questions now. I'll give you that microphone. Who would like to ask a question? Here you go, mate.
Thank you. There was one of those clauses that stated that Indigenous people have the right to practice legal systems independent of the state, and I wondered how would that function in the context of New Zealand. Like, if a Māori person committed a crime, would they have the option of going through a separate system to address that crime?
Yeah, the Declaration does say that, as you paraphrased. And I understand from comments that Willie Jackson has made in public that was one of the recommendations of the panel that was established here in New Zealand to look at the Declaration's implementation. And it was the political backlash to that he anticipated that was one of the key reasons he didn't take the recommendations to Cabinet. So I think that kind of system is probably unlikely to come into development anytime soon. But I guess the broad principle can be seen through Māori youth courts, for example, which operate according to tikanga to a degree on marae and so on. And from what I understand of those, they do work quite well. But it is a different concept. It's a concept of the state trying to make arrangements that suit Māori, as distinct from Māori making their own arrangements. But there are other different ways of looking at it too. I mean, if the crime that is committed and being tried is a crime against tikanga, for example, overfishing in contravention of a rahui, for example. Maybe in that circumstance it would be easier to justify politically a kind of trial that is an expression of the local iwi that's been affronted of its rangatiratanga. But when we're talking about drink driving convictions or things that might be an offence against the state as opposed to an offence against tikanga, then I think it's going to be politically rather difficult, and I can't imagine a government brave enough to, or a political party indeed, perhaps other than the Māori Party, brave enough to put it to an election.
That's right.
What future policy making do you think could shape the hidden curriculum in education today?
It's a very big question, but I guess there's a fundamental question: what is schooling for? Who's it for? And who decides? And I think when Māori people are involved in deciding, then colonisation as a part of that hidden curriculum is obviously contested. But there are other hidden curriculums that can come in there too, of course. And it's a point that highlights the political nature of curriculum. And there's an American public administration writer, Michael Lipsky, who writes about the power of the street level bureaucrat. So the police officer's discretion as to whether to give someone a speeding ticket or not. The nurse's discretion as to which patients to prioritise in a hospital setting, and the teacher's discretion as to who's learning to prioritise or privilege are things where there's often a difference between official state policy, that everyone gets the same chance to learn to read when they go to school. Teachers can subvert that, of course, and sometimes they do it for political reasons. Sometimes there's racism gets in the way of professional people doing what they're supposed to do, and hidden curriculum's a good example of that. And I'm not sure that you can ever eliminate it completely, but by asking questions like, what is this school for? Who's it here to serve? Who decides? Then perhaps the scope for that kind of hidden curriculum is narrowed a little bit.
Hi, can you clarify with the Sustainable Development Goals, because it's set at UN level, so it's therefore a global aim, then sovereign states then are to take what is in them and then see how they can apply them in their own country. So does that still give us some sovereignty? And how much can we determine out of those that suits our country, but also can then be applied back into the SDGs?
Well, I think that's probably one of the reasons that the 17 goals are very broadly expressed. When we look, for example, at SDG 8, economic growth and decent employment. Well, what does decent employment mean? It's a culturally contextualised question. It's contextualised by geography and by possibility. So, of course, the answer is not the same from one jurisdiction to the next necessarily. But my critique is that because culture as a concept is not present in the goals, they don't have the robust framework that's required to address things like Indigenous self-determination. And there's no reason why New Zealand can't if it wants to, say, well, we think culture's important, we think Tiriti's important, and when we're looking at these goals, we'll think about it with that in mind. And I guess that's what I'm investigating and advocating with the book, is that we do that, and that one of the ways in which we do that is with reference to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and an acceptance that people think about what policy should achieve, people think about what's good and what's not, from culturally framed, epistemologically framed perspectives.
Just briefly, Gail Duncan here, regarding farming and Indigenous sustainable farming practices, and thinking in terms of climate change and other, I felt that you were emphasising a more commercial, and going into a more westernised commercial expansion of farming, and not talking about how much more we might be needing the knowledge, Indigenous knowledge of sustainable farming practices. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, agriculture is not my field of expertise, but I'm conscious that Māori farming is a multi-million-dollar industry in New Zealand, and a very significant contributor to Māori well-being. And I think, as a matter of principle, if people want to be subsistence farmers, then they should certainly be able to do that. But if they want a bit more of farming, and if their ambitions and aspirations are a bit different, then I don't think it's for the goals to tell people, set your ambitions low. And that's really the point I'm making there.
I think that your insights that culture is the absolute determinant of the sorts of interactions we're talking about is absolutely critically important, and it's important not just nationally but also internationally. So I'd just like to ask, and you talk about critical Tiriti theory, and also a different approach to the what we might call the liberal democratic culture, whatever it is. Does the dominant culture need further explication? Is the dynamic that's happening here is that the indigenous culture is much more defined and defining itself, and because of that, it appears to me making great strides forward in the development of our common culture. But what worries me more is the lack of definition of the dominant culture, what might be called the liberal democratic culture. And is that problematic? And should we be thinking about what's happening on the other side of the cultural partnership as well?
Yeah, I think Pākehā is a term that many people dislike, but often can't really explain why they dislike it. Often because it's a Māori word, but the Māori word prevails because people haven't developed a word of their own. Sometimes you hear New Zealander thrown around, but that's a nationality, it's not an ethnicity, so it doesn't actually get us very far, and it's often associated with discourses of assimilation and so on. But one of the reasons I elsewhere critique the partnership discourse is that it tends to position the Crown as belonging to Pākehā and rangatiratanga as the sole domain or sphere of Māori authority. And I think that ill definition that you talk about is both a product of that and a contributor to that in terms of how we think about ourselves, or sometimes the Tiriti is talked about as a an agreement between races. I prefer to think about it as an agreement between political communities. And political communities can evolve and change and overlap and intersect and so on. And I think that's when you're talking about the distribution of responsibilities and authority, then I think it's better to think about how those are distributed among political communities rather than among races. So culture's all part of it, but I think when we talk of the New Zealand state, I don't think it's democratic or just to think of it as the Pākehā state with this Māori partner over there somewhere. I think we've got to continue to develop and construct a state that's for all of us, and where we can all have our own ways of thinking. Some of us can drink our Lion Red, others can drink our our Chardonnay and our Riesling and so on. And it doesn't matter what's in your glass. What matters is your ability or commitment to ensuring that it's a good party for everybody. And I think, we're better at that in a lot of ways than sometimes we give ourselves credit for. We're better than a lot of other jurisdictions. But continuing to think about who we are, but not in a way that entrenches the them and us binary of partnership, I think is quite helpful. So, and this is why I like the analogy of, liberalism saying everyone can come to the party, but you all got to drink the same thing. If we can think in public life, no, we don't have to all drink the same thing. We don't have to all wear the same hat or wear the same coat. Then we have a foundation for deliberation and for participatory parity and all those other things. And we can all answer questions for ourselves about why do we farm, constrained by the obligation that our farming practices don't impinge on other people's rights to clean water and so on, which is going to become an election issue when we look at the National Party's recently announced agriculture policy, where those sorts of things are perhaps not privileged. So I think we've gone off a long way from the original question, but to bring it back to that point, of course everybody's culture is important. How we reflect it, and reflect that Pākehā isn't an homogenous cultural entity, as some discussions frame it, is a useful thing. But how do we deliberate?
Peter, did you?
I just want to underscore a couple of things that you've said, Dominic. One is, I think that at this moment, under this government, we have a classic example where it's really clear the Crown is not a Pākehā institution. The Parliament, the executive of the Parliament is in fact, has huge input from Māori people, as it should be. So I think that that's one really important thing that we get away from. The Crown equals Pākehā and rangatiratanga sitting over there at the marae. It's not about that at all. The second comment that I'd make is to go back, Mike, to your original question and affirm that when we are thinking about interacting as cultures, the culture which is the dominant culture within Pākehā or non-Māori New Zealand is that of Western Europe and that tradition. So, and there is actually an enormous amount of really fantastic stuff which is driving a lot of what we are all working for. All the notions of justice, all the notions of equality, all the notions of sustainability and the environment, all of that, you can find that in the tradition that I share, as well as being really, really excited about the insights that come out of a Māori worldview. So I don't buy into Pākehā bad, Māori good dichotomy either, because I think that what we're building here in Aotearoa is a very exciting genuine coming together of different cultures.
I think a simple thing like what is it now? 30% of the cabinet is Māori is hugely significant, but it hasn't been the case perhaps for long enough to test the exact nature of that significance and what it means. But one imagines that the way the cabinet reasons, the way it thinks, not the policy decisions it makes, but the intellectual processes it goes through to make those are very, very different to the Longi cabinet or the Nash cabinet, for example, where the ethnic makeup was so different, and time and place and the gender balance and all those things also make a difference. But it takes time to test, and the idea that the Crown is also Māori is, I think, an important one to advance and aspire to, but I suspect it's still very much contested among Māori communities. Yeah. And I think the reason it's contested is that it's been
so unfair.
Well, yeah, and people have good reason to see the Crown as an adversary. Yeah. The ideal is that changes. And if the Crown is also Māori, then it must change.
And I think part of the underlying point or thought in my comment is that there is also a very large Eastern world out beyond our shores, which is increasingly coming into our cultural mix as well. And I'm conscious of just listening to a very interesting debate yesterday where an Indian professor in an American university talking about a Chinese experiment in developing, introducing English-speaking people to modern Chinese thinking, talked about how the West thinks in logical terms in lots of ways. What's the problem? What's the solution? The East thinks, what does our history tell us? And I think we do have to think into a wider world, because I think it will also bring back, and as I sort of see the loop, that the Maori world is much, in some ways, in my observation, much closer to that wider Eastern world than perhaps the Western way of looking at things. Anyway, that's getting into another topic and subject which we have taken up from time to time. So, it's for me to say, ngā mihi nui kaurua, ngā mihi nui Dominic, ngā mihi nui Peter. I think it's been a very interesting and informative and discussion and presentations, and I too look forward with great hope to the future for Aotearoa New Zealand as we tease these questions out. So that's it. Thank you very much. Good night all. And
thank you. Thanks for coming. Oh, okay.